Declassified. September 15, 1944. The morning mist clung to the shattered remnants of what had once been the village of Grandmesnil, Belgium, like a burial shroud refusing to lift from the dead. Staff Sergeant Thomas Hammer McKenna crouched behind the twisted wreckage of a German Panzer IV, its steel hull punctured and blackened by artillery fire, listening to the rhythmic thud of enemy mortars falling 200 yards to his east. The sound echoed off the broken stone walls of bombed-out houses with a hollow percussion that reminded him, oddly, of the sound his father's hammer had made against oak planks in their workshop back in Duluth, Minnesota. The irony wasn't lost on him that the nickname his squad had given him for his relentless work ethic would soon take on an entirely different meaning. The air tasted of cordite and smoke, tinged with the metallic bite of blood and the sickly sweet stench of decomposing flesh that had become as familiar as morning coffee during his 8 months in the European theater. Frost had formed on the barrel of his M1 Garand during the pre-dawn hours, and now, as weak September sunlight tried to penetrate the haze, condensation dripped steadily from the metal onto his mud-caked boots. His breath came in visible puffs, each exhalation a small cloud that dissipated quickly in the cold Belgian air. Around him, the landscape bore the scars of 3 days of brutal fighting, shell craters filled with stagnant water, telephone poles snapped like matchsticks, and the skeletal remains of buildings that had stood for centuries before the war arrived with its appetite for destruction. The German 12th SS Panzer Division had established what military intelligence called an impregnable defensive position along a ridge that commanded the entire valley. For 72 hours, American forces had thrown themselves against those fortified positions with the desperation of men who knew that failure here meant the entire Allied advance would stall just as winter approached. 3 separate infantry assaults had been repelled with devastating losses. The 1st Battalion of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment had been reduced from 850 men to fewer than 200 effective soldiers. The 2nd Armored Division had lost 16 Sherman tanks in a single morning, their burning hulks now serving as monuments to German defensive superiority. What made the situation even more desperate was the intelligence reports that continued to arrive from division headquarters. German reinforcements were moving south from the Ruhr Valley, 2 full panzer divisions with fresh troops, new equipment, and enough ammunition to hold their positions through the winter. If the Americans couldn't break through within the next 48 hours, the entire offensive would collapse, potentially setting back the Allied advance by months and condemning thousands more soldiers to die in a prolonged winter campaign. McKenna shifted his weight, feeling the cold seep through his wool uniform and into his bones. His squad, what remained of it, was scattered among the rubble around him. Private Danny Kowalski from Detroit lay behind a pile of bricks that had once been someone's kitchen wall, his Springfield rifle trained on a German machine gun nest that had been silent for the past 20 minutes. Corporal James, Mississippi, Washington had taken position in what remained of a church bell tower, using his sniper rifle to keep German heads down while the squad maneuvered. Only 5 men remained from the original 12 who had landed at Normandy 3 months earlier. The German defensive position was a masterwork of military engineering that exploited every advantage the terrain offered. They had turned the medieval stone buildings into interconnected fortresses, using the thick walls as natural bunkers while connecting them with a network of trenches and tunnels that allowed troops to move unseen between positions. Machine gun nests were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that any advancing American force would be caught in a deadly crossfire with nowhere to seek cover. Mortar teams had pre-registered every possible approach route, meaning they could drop accurate fire on any attacking force within seconds of movement being detected. But it wasn't just the physical obstacles that made the position so formidable, it was the men defending it. The 12th SS Panzer Division was composed largely of veterans who had survived 3 years of combat on the Russian front before being transferred west to face the Allied invasion. These weren't green recruits or aging reservists, they were hardened soldiers who had learned their craft in the most brutal fighting of the war. They knew how to make every shot count, how to conserve ammunition while maximizing casualties, and how to exploit the psychological pressure that comes with repeated failed assaults. Intelligence estimates put German strength at approximately 240 soldiers, supported by 8 heavy machine guns, 4 81mm mortars, 2 PaK-40 anti-tank guns, and a self-propelled artillery piece that had been positioned to fire down the length of the valley. Their ammunition supplies appeared to be adequate for sustained operations, and they had established multiple fallback positions in case their primary defensive line was breached. Most troubling of all, aerial reconnaissance had identified what appeared to be minefields covering the most likely approach routes, meaning that any American assault would have to advance through a maze of buried explosives while under direct fire from multiple positions. The mathematics of the situation were stark and unforgiving. Every previous assault had followed conventional infantry tactics, artillery preparation followed by advancing troops attempting to close with the enemy through coordinated fire and movement. Each time, the Germans had weathered the artillery barrage in their stone shelters, then emerged to devastate the advancing Americans with accurate, disciplined fire. The casualty ratios were unsustainable. For every German killed, the Americans were losing 8 to 10 men. At this rate, the entire regiment would be wiped out within a week, and the German position would remain intact. Battalion commanders had tried everything in their tactical playbook. They had attempted flanking maneuvers, only to discover that the Germans had anticipated these routes and positioned machine guns to cover them. They had tried night infiltration, but German flares and coordinated defensive fires had turned the darkness into a killing field. They had even requested close air support, but low-hanging clouds and the proximity of American forces to German positions made precision bombing impossible without risking catastrophic friendly fire incidents. As McKenna watched the German positions through his binoculars, he found himself thinking not about military tactics or casualty statistics, but about something much more fundamental: the rhythm of work, the satisfaction of solving problems with simple tools and practical thinking. Back home in Minnesota, he had spent 15 years working alongside his father in their carpentry shop, learning that there was always more than one way to approach any problem. Sometimes the most elegant solution wasn't the most obvious one, and sometimes the tools you needed were already in your hands if you just knew how to use them differently. The morning sun was climbing higher now, burning off some of the mist and revealing more details of the German defensive positions. McKenna could see movement in the windows of a 3-story stone building that served as the enemy's primary observation post. Occasionally, the glint of sunlight off optical equipment betrayed the position of spotters who were undoubtedly calling in accurate fire on any American movement. This was how 60 of their fellow soldiers had died over the past 2 days, and how many more would die unless someone found a way to change the fundamental equation of the battle. But Thomas McKenna was beginning to see something that no one else had noticed: a pattern in the German defensive arrangement that might, just might, contain the seeds of its own destruction. It would require thinking like a carpenter rather than a soldier, approaching the problem not as a military obstacle to be overcome through firepower and courage, but as a structural challenge that could be solved with the right leverage applied at precisely the right point. The idea forming in his mind was so simple, so unconventional, that he almost dismissed it as the desperate fantasy of an exhausted soldier. Almost, but not quite. Because Thomas McKenna had learned long ago that sometimes the most impossible problems had the simplest solutions, and sometimes a hammer was exactly the right tool for the job, you just had to know where to swing it. Thomas McKenna had been born into the sound of hammers and the smell of fresh-cut pine. His father, Patrick McKenna, had immigrated from County Cork, Ireland, in 1898 with nothing but a set of well-worn carpentry tools and an unshakable belief that hard work could build a life worth living in America. By 1920, when Thomas was born, Patrick had established McKenna & Sons Carpentry as one of Duluth's most respected building contractors, specializing in the kind of solid, practical construction that could withstand Minnesota's brutal winters and the harsh realities of life on the shores of Lake Superior. The McKenna workshop occupied a converted warehouse near the docks, where the sound of Patrick's hammer would begin before sunrise and continue until well after sunset during the busy summer months. Thomas learned to recognize the different rhythms his father's hammer made against various types of wood: the sharp crack against hard maple, the deeper thunk against soft pine, the metallic ring when a nail struck a knot and had to be withdrawn and repositioned. By age 8, Thomas could identify the type of wood being worked just by listening to the sound from 3 rooms away. Patrick believed in teaching through demonstration rather than explanation. He would hand Thomas increasingly complex tasks, first holding boards steady while joints were cut, then measuring and marking lumber, eventually graduating to actual construction work under close supervision. "A man's hands are his most honest tools," Patrick would say in his fading Irish accent. "They can't lie to you the way words can, and they can't fail you if you've trained them proper." Thomas absorbed these lessons along with the practical skills of measuring twice, cutting once, and understanding that every piece of wood had its own character that had to be respected rather than forced. The Depression years tested the McKenna family's resilience in ways that would shape Thomas's approach to problem-solving for the rest of his life. Construction work became scarce as banks failed and families lost their homes, but Patrick adapted by taking on repair work, furniture building, and any other job that required skilled hands and reliable craftsmanship. Thomas learned to make do with limited materials, to find creative solutions when proper supplies weren't available, and to see opportunity where others saw only obstacles. When they couldn't afford new lumber for a project, they would salvage usable wood from demolished buildings, carefully removing nails and assessing each board for structural integrity and potential applications. These lean years taught Thomas that innovation often came from necessity rather than abundance. He watched his father design and build custom furniture using wood that other carpenters would have discarded as unusable, creating beautiful pieces by working with the natural flaws and irregularities rather than against them. A warped board became the curved back of a rocking chair. A piece of wood with an unusual grain pattern became the centerpiece of a dining room table. Patrick's philosophy was simple: every problem contains its own solution if you look at it long enough and from the right angle. By 1939, Thomas had developed into a skilled craftsman in his own right, capable of handling complex projects independently and trusted by Duluth's wealthiest families to work on their most prestigious homes. He had also grown into a man of impressive physical strength, standing 6 feet 2 inches tall with the broad shoulders and calloused hands that came from 15 years of heavy labor. His reputation extended beyond mere technical competence. Clients knew that Thomas McKenna would find a way to complete any project, regardless of the obstacles or complications that arose during construction. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything for the McKenna family, as it did for millions of American families across the country. Thomas's younger brother Sean enlisted in the Navy within a week of the attack, driven by a patriotic fury that burned too hot to contain. Thomas felt the same anger, the same desire for vengeance against the forces that had shattered America's sense of security, but his response was more measured and practical. He spent weeks considering his options, weighing his responsibilities to his family's business against his duty to his country. The decision came during a conversation with his father on a cold February evening in 1942. Patrick had been unusually quiet during dinner, finally breaking his silence to tell Thomas something he had never mentioned before. During the Great War, Patrick had served with the Irish Guards on the Western Front, participating in some of the most brutal fighting of that conflict. He had seen what war could do to young men, how it could break them in body and spirit, but he had also seen how ordinary men could rise to extraordinary challenges when their cause was just and their need was great. "I've never spoken of those days because there seemed no point in dwelling on old horrors," Patrick said, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "But I'll tell you this, there's a kind of fight that comes along once in a man's lifetime, if he's unlucky, where everything decent in the world depends on ordinary people doing extraordinary things. This is that fight, son. And if you don't go, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what you might have contributed to the outcome." Thomas enlisted in the Army the following morning, specifically requesting assignment to the airborne forces after learning that paratroopers received additional training in improvised construction and field engineering. His mechanical aptitude and leadership experience made him an obvious candidate for non-commissioned officer training, but his performance during basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, initially suggested that the transition from civilian craftsman to combat soldier would be more difficult than anticipated. The problem wasn't physical conditioning. Years of construction work had left Thomas in better shape than most recruits, but rather an inability to adapt his methodical, perfectionist approach to the fast-paced, good-enough mentality that characterized military training. When ordered to construct a field fortification in 30 minutes, Thomas would spend 25 minutes carefully planning and measuring, producing a nearly perfect result that impressed instructors but arrived too late to be tactically useful. His squad mates began calling him Hammer, not because of his carpentry background, but because of his tendency to approach every problem with the same steady, methodical rhythm regardless of time constraints or changing circumstances. The incident that nearly ended Thomas's military career occurred during a training exercise in advanced field engineering. His squad had been tasked with destroying a simulated enemy bridge using conventional demolition charges, but Thomas had spotted what he believed was a more elegant solution. Removing 3 specific support bolts would cause the structure to collapse under its own weight without requiring any explosives at all. He spent valuable time implementing his solution, which worked perfectly but took 45 minutes longer than the prescribed method. The reviewing officer, a career soldier who had no patience for unconventional thinking, recommended Thomas for immediate transfer to a non-combat support role. Thomas's salvation came in the form of Captain James Mitchell, a combat engineer who had been observing the exercise and recognized something valuable in Thomas's approach. Captain Mitchell had seen enough combat in North Africa to understand that real war often required improvised solutions to unexpected problems, and he appreciated soldiers who could think creatively under pressure. He intervened on Thomas's behalf, arguing that the army needed men who could see beyond standard procedures when circumstances demanded innovation. Under Captain Mitchell's mentorship, Thomas learned to balance his natural perfectionism with the speed and adaptability required for combat operations. More importantly, he began to understand how his civilian skills could be adapted to military purposes. The same spatial reasoning that allowed him to visualize complex construction projects could be applied to battlefield engineering problems. The same attention to structural details that made him an excellent carpenter could help him identify weaknesses in enemy fortifications. The same steady nerves that allowed him to work safely at great heights could serve him well when working under enemy fire. Captain Mitchell also taught Thomas something that would prove crucial during his later service in Europe: the importance of observing patterns and understanding systems rather than focusing exclusively on individual components. A bridge isn't just a collection of beams and cables, Mitchell would say during their engineering discussions. It's a system where every component depends on every other component. Remove the right piece, apply pressure at the right point, and the whole structure fails. The same principle applies to enemy defensive positions. Every fortress has a keystone, and every defensive system has a critical vulnerability. Your job is to train your eye to see what others miss. By the time Thomas completed his training and received orders for deployment to England in preparation for the invasion of France, he had developed into exactly the kind of soldier the army needed for the complex challenges ahead. He possessed the technical skills to handle sophisticated engineering problems, the physical strength and endurance required for airborne operations, and most importantly, a mind that could approach tactical problems from unexpected angles. His commanding officers recognized his potential by promoting him to staff sergeant and assigning him to lead a squad of combat engineers attached to the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The crossing to England aboard a converted Liberty ship gave Thomas his first real taste of the war's global scope and human cost. The convoy included hospital ships carrying wounded soldiers back from the Mediterranean theater, and Thomas spent hours talking with men who had survived the fighting in Italy and North Africa. Their stories reinforced Captain Mitchell's lessons about the importance of adaptability and creative thinking in combat. Time and again, these veterans described situations where conventional tactics had failed and survival had depended on someone finding an unconventional solution to an impossible problem. When Thomas first saw the English countryside from the train carrying his unit to their staging area near Portsmouth, he was struck by how much it reminded him of rural Minnesota: the same rolling hills, the same mixture of farmland and forest, the same quality of light filtering through morning mist. But the similarities were superficial. This landscape bore the scars of 5 years of war, military convoys clogging every road, airfields carved out of former pastures, anti-aircraft guns positioned in village squares, and everywhere the sense of a nation that had been holding its breath for too long. The months of training in England refined Thomas's skills and gave him his first opportunity to work with the kind of advanced equipment and techniques he would need for combat operations in Europe. He learned to identify German fortification patterns, to calculate the precise amount of explosive needed to destroy different types of structures, and to work effectively with infantry units during combined operations. But perhaps more importantly, he learned to trust his instincts and to recognize that his unconventional background might be exactly what was needed when conventional approaches proved inadequate. The morning of June 6, 1944, found Thomas McKenna sitting in a C-47 transport plane somewhere over the English Channel, checking his equipment one final time before jumping into occupied France. His parachute was properly secured, his rifle was clean and loaded, and his pack contained the specialized tools and explosive charges that might mean the difference between success and failure for his squad's mission. But as the first anti-aircraft fire began to light up the sky around their formation, Thomas found himself thinking not about military tactics or combat procedures, but about something his father had told him years earlier: every job starts with understanding what you're really trying to accomplish, son. Sometimes that's different from what people tell you you're trying to accomplish. Within hours, Thomas McKenna would discover just how prophetic those words had been, and how the skills learned in a carpentry shop in Duluth, Minnesota, could be applied to problems that no military manual had ever anticipated. The morning of September 12, 1944, brought with it the kind of cold, penetrating rain that seemed designed to sap the morale of exhausted soldiers. Thomas McKenna had been awake since 0300 hours, studying German positions through binoculars while trying to ignore the persistent ache in his left shoulder where shrapnel from a mortar round had found its mark 3 days earlier. The medic had dug out the metal fragments and declared the wound superficial, but superficial wounds still hurt when you had to hold steady aim for hours at a time while lying on cold, wet ground. The tactical situation facing the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment was deteriorating by the hour, and everyone from the newest replacement to Colonel Tucker himself knew it. The German 12th SS Panzer Division had turned the medieval town of Grandmesnil into a fortress that defied every conventional approach to infantry assault. Their defensive positions exploited centuries of military architecture, using thick stone walls that had been built to withstand siege engines as natural bunkers against modern artillery. Intelligence reports painted a picture of defensive depth that extended far beyond what initial reconnaissance had suggested. The Germans had spent weeks preparing their positions, using forced labor from local civilians to dig connecting trenches between buildings, creating underground ammunition storage points, and establishing multiple fallback positions that would allow them to conduct a fighting withdrawal even if their primary defensive line was breached. They had also positioned observers in the church steeple and several other tall buildings, giving them complete visual coverage of all likely approach routes. The American forces had already paid a terrible price for the intelligence they had gathered about German capabilities. 3 separate reconnaissance patrols had been wiped out while attempting to identify enemy positions and strength. The 1st Battalion's first assault on September 10 had been repelled with devastating casualties when advancing troops walked into a carefully orchestrated killing zone. Machine gun crossfire had pinned down the attackers while mortar rounds fell among them with deadly precision, forcing the survivors to withdraw under cover of smoke grenades, leaving behind 43 dead and wounded comrades. The 2nd assault, launched at dawn on September 11 with support from 2 Sherman tanks, had seemed initially more promising. The tanks had been able to suppress several machine gun positions, allowing infantry to advance closer to the German lines than any previous attempt had achieved. But the Germans had revealed a nasty surprise in the form of 2 Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons that destroyed both Shermans within minutes of each other. Without armor support, the infantry found themselves trapped in open ground under devastating fire from positions they couldn't even see clearly enough to return effective fire against. Colonel Tucker had requested air support, but the weather had been uncooperative for 3 straight days. Low-hanging clouds and intermittent rain made precision bombing impossible, and the proximity of American forces to German positions created an unacceptable risk of friendly fire casualties. Artillery support was available, but previous bombardments had proven largely ineffective against the stone buildings that formed the backbone of the German defensive system. The medieval construction that had protected inhabitants from centuries of warfare continued to serve its purpose against 20th-century weapons. What made the situation particularly frustrating was that everyone involved understood the strategic importance of breaking through the German positions quickly. Intelligence from higher headquarters indicated that German reinforcements were moving south from the Ruhr industrial region, 2 full panzer divisions with enough strength to turn the current defensive position into the anchor point for a major German counteroffensive. If the Americans couldn't punch through within the next 48 hours, the entire Allied advance would stall just as winter weather began to favor defensive operations. The mathematics of attrition warfare were working against the Americans in ways that made conventional tactics increasingly untenable. German forces were estimated at approximately 240 soldiers, well-equipped, well-supplied, and fighting from prepared positions that multiplied their effective strength by a factor of 3 or 4. American forces in the immediate area totaled nearly 800 men, but they were attacking across open ground against an enemy that could engage them from concealed positions with superior fields of fire. Previous casualties had reduced American effective strength while German losses remained minimal. Intelligence estimates suggested that the Germans had lost fewer than 20 men during 3 days of fighting, while American casualties exceeded 150 killed, wounded, and missing. At this rate, the regiment would be combat ineffective within a week, and the German position would remain intact to anchor whatever counteroffensive Berlin was planning. Thomas McKenna had participated in both major assault attempts, and he had spent the quiet hours between attacks studying the German defensive system with the analytical mind of an engineer rather than the tactical thinking of an infantryman. What he observed troubled him far more than the casualty reports or strategic implications that dominated discussions at the command level. The German defensive system wasn't just strong, it was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. The key to German defensive success lay not in any single strongpoint, but in the interconnected nature of their positions. They had turned individual buildings into mutually supporting fortresses, with machine gun positions located to provide overlapping fields of fire that eliminated dead space where attacking troops might find cover. Mortar teams were positioned to provide indirect fire support to any threatened sector, while riflemen in elevated positions could engage targets that tried to work around the primary machine gun positions. More troubling still was the evidence of German tactical sophistication in their use of the terrain. They had identified every possible approach route and established kill zones that channeled attacking forces into predetermined areas where concentrated fire could inflict maximum casualties. They had also prepared alternate firing positions that allowed them to shift their defensive focus quickly if attackers tried to exploit what appeared to be a weakness in their lines. But as Thomas continued his methodical study of the German positions, he began to notice something that didn't fit the pattern of careful defensive planning. The Germans had made their positions mutually supporting, but this very strength contained a potential weakness that might be exploitable if approached correctly. Like a well-engineered building where every component contributed to the overall structural integrity, the German defensive system depended on all components functioning together effectively. The observation that would change everything came on the morning of September 13, when Thomas was watching German positions through binoculars during the pre-dawn hours. He noticed movement in a second-story window of what intelligence had identified as the German command post, and something about the timing of that movement caught his attention. The figure in the window appeared for exactly 30 seconds, then disappeared for exactly 2 minutes, then reappeared for another 30 seconds. Thomas began timing other German activities, sentries walking their posts, machine gun crews rotating personnel, observers scanning American positions with binoculars. What emerged was a pattern of activity that suggested the Germans were operating on a precisely coordinated schedule, probably to minimize their exposure to American sniper fire while ensuring continuous coverage of all potential approach routes. This discovery led Thomas to a realization that would have been impossible without his background in construction work. The German defensive system wasn't just physically interconnected, it was temporally interconnected as well. Their entire defensive scheme depended on precise timing and coordination between positions that couldn't communicate with each other except through predetermined signals and schedules. Thomas had seen the same principle at work in large construction projects, where dozens of workers had to coordinate their activities without constant supervision. The key was establishing routines and schedules that allowed everyone to anticipate what others would be doing at any given time. It was efficient and effective, but it was also rigid and potentially vulnerable to disruption if someone could interfere with the timing mechanisms that made the whole system work. The idea that began forming in Thomas's mind was so simple that he initially dismissed it as the desperate fantasy of an exhausted soldier looking for hope where none existed. But the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that he had identified something that everyone else, from battalion intelligence officers to regimental commanders, had missed entirely. The German defensive system was like a precisely engineered piece of machinery where every component had to function in perfect synchronization with every other component. It was strong, it was effective, and it had proven capable of repelling every assault the Americans had attempted. But like any machine that depended on precise timing and coordination, it might be vulnerable to disruption if someone could find the right place to apply the right kind of pressure at exactly the right moment. Thomas McKenna had spent 15 years learning how to identify the critical stress points in complex structures, how to understand load-bearing relationships between seemingly separate components, and most importantly, how to recognize when a small change in one place could create cascading effects throughout an entire system. Now, as he studied the German positions with fresh eyes informed by his civilian expertise, he began to see possibilities that pure military training would never have revealed. The solution he envisioned wouldn't require additional troops, heavier weapons, or complex tactical maneuvers. It would require only a clear understanding of how the German system actually worked, precise timing, and the kind of practical problem-solving skills that Thomas had learned in his father's workshop back in Duluth. The question now was whether he could convince his superiors to let him try an approach that violated every principle of conventional infantry tactics but might be exactly what the situation required. Thomas McKenna's breakthrough came not through military inspiration, but through the practical problem-solving methods his father had taught him during 15 years of construction work. Patrick McKenna had always said that the most elegant solutions were often the simplest ones, and that complex problems usually broke down into a series of smaller, manageable tasks if you approached them with the right mindset and the right tools. The first step in Thomas's analysis was to stop thinking like a soldier trying to overcome an enemy position and start thinking like a carpenter examining a complex structure. Every building had load-bearing elements that were critical to its integrity, and every defensive system had components that were essential to its effectiveness. The trick was identifying which components were truly essential versus those that appeared important but were actually redundant or secondary. Thomas had noticed that the German defensive system operated on what he recognized as a rotation schedule designed to maintain constant coverage while allowing individual soldiers to rest and resupply. Machine gun crews would maintain their positions for exactly 45 minutes, then be relieved by fresh personnel who would take over the same fields of fire. Observers would scan assigned sectors for 30-minute intervals before rotating to different positions. Even sentry duties followed predictable patterns that ensured no approach route was left unwatched for more than a few minutes at a time. This level of coordination required precise timing mechanisms that everyone understood and followed religiously. Thomas realized that the Germans were probably using a combination of synchronized watches and visual signals to maintain their rotation schedule. Any disruption to this timing would create gaps in their coverage, but only if the disruption occurred at precisely the right moment and affected the right components of their system. The second element of Thomas's solution involved understanding the physical layout of the German positions in terms of structural engineering rather than military tactics. The stone buildings that anchored their defensive line weren't just individual strongpoints, they were connected by a network of trenches and communication lines that formed what engineers would call a load distribution system. Remove or disable the right connections, and the entire system would lose its structural integrity. Thomas had identified 3 buildings that served as the primary coordination points for German defensive activities. Intelligence reports suggested these buildings housed command elements, communication equipment, and ammunition storage facilities that supported the entire defensive network. More importantly, Thomas had observed that these buildings were the source of the visual signals that coordinated rotation schedules and response to American activities. The third component of Thomas's analysis focused on what he privately called the cascade effect, the way that small disruptions in one part of a system could create progressively larger disruptions throughout the entire system if the timing and targeting were precise enough. Thomas had seen this principle at work in controlled building demolitions, where removing specific structural elements in the correct sequence could cause an entire building to collapse under its own weight. Thomas believed that the German defensive system was vulnerable to the same kind of cascade effect if he could disrupt their coordination mechanisms at exactly the right moment during their rotation cycle. The key was understanding that their strength, the precision and predictability of their defensive routine, was also their greatest weakness if someone could exploit the timing relationships that made the whole system work. The innovation Thomas devised was elegantly simple in concept but required precise execution and split-second timing to succeed. He had noticed that the Germans used a series of mirror signals reflected from the church steeple to coordinate activities between their dispersed positions. These signals were probably necessary because radio communication would be vulnerable to American interception and jamming, while voice communication across the extended defensive line would be impossible under combat conditions. Thomas's plan involved using a combination of his construction skills and his understanding of optical principles to turn the German signaling system against itself. The mirrors they were using to coordinate their defenses could be temporarily redirected to create false signals that would disrupt their rotation schedules and create temporary gaps in their coverage. But this would only work if the false signals were introduced at precisely the right moment in their cycle and if the disruption was coordinated with a specific type of assault that could exploit the resulting confusion. The materials Thomas needed for his plan were readily available from battlefield salvage and standard military equipment. He would need several small mirrors or reflective surfaces, a way to mount and aim them precisely, and most importantly, a clear understanding of the German signaling schedule so he could time his intervention for maximum effect. The physical construction would be relatively simple for someone with his carpentry background, but the timing and execution would require the kind of precision that allowed no margin for error. Thomas spent 2 days secretly observing German signaling activities from multiple positions, using the same methodical approach he had applied to surveying construction sites back home. He recorded the timing of signals, the direction they were sent, the apparent responses from different German positions, and the correlation between signaling activities and changes in German defensive posture. What emerged was a precise schedule that operated like clockwork, with signals sent every 15 minutes to coordinate rotation activities and immediate response signals that could be triggered to coordinate defensive fires. The beauty of Thomas's plan was that it required minimal resources and could be executed by a small team working independently of larger tactical operations. Unlike previous assault attempts that had required coordination between multiple units and extensive fire support, this approach could be implemented by Thomas and 3 or 4 carefully selected soldiers who understood both the technical requirements and the precise timing necessary for success. The technical execution would involve 3 simultaneous actions that had to be coordinated to the second. First, Thomas would redirect the German mirror signals at the precise moment when rotation schedules called for machine gun crews to be relieved. This would create false coordination signals that would cause some German positions to stand down their weapons while others remained alert, breaking the overlapping fields of fire that made their defensive systems so effective. Second, a small team would use the temporary gap in German coverage to approach their primary ammunition storage facility, which Thomas had identified through careful observation of resupply activities. The goal wouldn't be to destroy the facility with conventional explosives, that would alert the entire German force and allow them to reorganize their defenses. Instead, Thomas planned to use his construction expertise to create what he called structural failure, removing specific supports that would cause the building to collapse on itself, burying the ammunition supplies and eliminating the Germans' ability to sustain prolonged defensive fires. Third, the confusion created by the false signals and the loss of their primary ammunition supply would be exploited by a coordinated infantry assault that would hit the German positions at the precise moment when their defensive coordination was most disrupted. This assault wouldn't follow conventional tactics of advancing across open ground under fire. Instead, it would use the temporary gaps in German coverage to infiltrate their defensive perimeter and engage them from unexpected directions. The entire operation would depend on precision timing that allowed no room for improvisation or adjustment once it began. Thomas compared it to the controlled demolition work he had observed in Detroit, where a single mistake in timing could cause a building to fall in the wrong direction, potentially killing workers and destroying adjacent structures. The margin for error was virtually non-existent, but the potential results, if everything worked as planned, could eliminate the German defensive position in less than 30 minutes without requiring massive casualties or heavy weapon support. Thomas knew that convincing his superiors to approve such an unconventional approach would be extremely difficult. Military doctrine emphasized proven tactics and coordination with higher headquarters, not improvised solutions based on civilian expertise. But he also knew that conventional approaches had failed repeatedly, casualties were mounting, and time was running out before German reinforcements arrived to turn a difficult situation into an impossible one. The key to gaining approval would be demonstrating that his plan wasn't just theoretically sound, but that it was based on careful observation and analysis of actual German activities rather than speculation or wishful thinking. Thomas spent another day documenting his observations with the kind of detailed precision that would satisfy military intelligence requirements, creating sketches of German positions, timing charts of their activities, and technical diagrams of the structural modifications he planned to implement. When Thomas finally approached Captain Mitchell with his plan, he presented it not as a desperate gamble, but as an engineering solution to a structural problem. He used the same methodical approach he had learned from his father, identifying the problem clearly, analyzing the available resources, proposing a specific solution with measurable objectives, and outlining the precise steps necessary for implementation. It was an approach that had worked for complex construction projects, and Thomas hoped it would work for the most complex challenge he had ever faced. The moment of truth arrived at 0347 hours on September 15, 1944, when Thomas McKenna lay concealed behind the rubble of what had once been the town's bakery, his hands steady despite the cold rain that had been falling since midnight. The carefully constructed mirror array was positioned precisely according to his calculations, angled to redirect German coordination signals at exactly the right moment in their rotation cycle. 3 fellow soldiers, volunteers who had studied his plan and understood their roles with the precision of seasoned craftsmen, waited in predetermined positions for the signal to begin the most unconventional military operation any of them had ever attempted. Corporal Washington occupied an overwatch position in the damaged church bell tower, his sniper rifle trained on the German observation post that controlled the primary signaling activities. His job was to eliminate the German signaler immediately after Thomas created the initial disruption, preventing them from recognizing the deception and correcting their coordination system before the cascade effect could take hold. Private Kowalski and Private Martinez had infiltrated to within 50 yards of the German ammunition storage facility, carrying the specialized tools and shaped charges that Thomas had prepared for creating what he called catastrophic structural failure. Thomas checked his watch one final time, confirming that the German rotation schedule called for machine gun crew changes in exactly 90 seconds. Everything he had observed and analyzed over the past week suggested that this was the moment of maximum vulnerability in their defensive system, when coordination signals would be most critical and any disruption would have the greatest cascading effect throughout their entire position. The weather conditions were far from ideal for precision work, but Thomas had learned to adapt his techniques to Minnesota winters that were just as cold and considerably more brutal than anything Belgium could offer. The rain actually provided some advantages, reducing visibility and masking the small sounds that might otherwise alert German sentries to unusual activity. More importantly, the overcast sky meant that German observers would be relying heavily on their mirror signaling system rather than visual coordination, making them more vulnerable to the kind of deception Thomas had planned. At exactly 0348 hours and 30 seconds, Thomas activated his mirror array, sending carefully timed light signals that perfectly mimicked the German coordination pattern while subtly altering the rotation instructions. The false signals indicated that machine gun crews in positions 2 and 5 should stand down for maintenance while positions 1 and 4 moved to alternate firing points. To German observers monitoring the signals from their command post, these instructions would appear routine and consistent with their normal rotation schedule. The effect was immediate and exactly what Thomas had anticipated. Machine gun crews in 2 critical positions ceased firing and began moving to what they believed were new positions, while other crews shifted their fields of fire to cover different sectors. For approximately 3 minutes, the overlapping coverage that made the German defensive system so effective was disrupted, creating narrow corridors that skilled infiltrators could use to approach the German perimeter without being detected. Corporal Washington's shot came at exactly the right moment, eliminating the German signaler just as he was beginning to recognize that something was wrong with the coordination system. The silenced rifle made only a soft coughing sound that was completely masked by the ambient noise of rain and distant artillery fire. Without their primary signaling coordinator, the German positions were temporarily unable to communicate changes in their defensive posture or coordinate responses to unexpected threats. Meanwhile, Kowalski and Martinez were executing the most technically challenging part of the operation. Thomas had taught them to identify the specific structural elements that supported the German ammunition storage facility, and they worked with the methodical precision of experienced carpenters rather than the haste typical of combat engineers. Instead of simply placing explosive charges and detonating them, they carefully removed 3 key support beams that Thomas had calculated would cause the entire structure to collapse inward on itself. The collapse came 12 minutes after the operation began, exactly as Thomas had predicted. The stone building that housed the majority of German ammunition supplies folded in on itself with a rumbling crash that sounded like thunder but contained none of the sharp crack of conventional explosive demolition. To German soldiers in other positions, it would appear that Allied artillery had scored a lucky hit rather than evidence of infiltration and sabotage. But Thomas had calculated the psychological effect as carefully as the structural mechanics. The loss of their primary ammunition supply would immediately force German commanders to ration their remaining ammunition, reducing the volume of defensive fire they could maintain and eliminating their ability to sustain prolonged defensive operations. More importantly, the timing of the collapse, occurring simultaneously with disruption of their communication system, would create exactly the kind of confusion and uncertainty that could be exploited by a coordinated infantry assault. The final phase of the operation began at exactly 0400 hours, when American forces launched what appeared to be another conventional frontal assault but was actually a carefully coordinated infiltration that exploited the temporary gaps in German defensive coverage. Instead of advancing across open ground in formation, small teams of infantry moved through the corridors that Thomas had identified, using the disruption in German coordination to approach their positions from unexpected directions. The German response was exactly what Thomas had predicted: confused, uncoordinated, and fatally delayed by their inability to communicate effectively between positions. Machine gun crews found themselves engaging targets from directions they hadn't anticipated, while mortar teams couldn't coordinate their fires effectively without the signaling system that had been disrupted by Thomas's deception. Individual German soldiers fought with their usual skill and determination, but the defensive system that had made them so effective was no longer functioning as an integrated whole. By 0430 hours, American forces had penetrated the German perimeter at 4 separate points and were engaged in close quarters fighting throughout the defensive position. The cascade effect that Thomas had anticipated was now fully manifest. What had begun as a minor disruption in coordination signals had progressed through structural collapse and communication breakdown to complete tactical disintegration of the German defensive system. The final German resistance collapsed at 0447 hours when the remaining defenders, cut off from their ammunition supplies and unable to coordinate their withdrawal, attempted to surrender rather than be destroyed piecemeal by American forces that now held tactical advantage throughout the battlefield. The entire operation, from the first false signal to the final German surrender, had lasted exactly 59 minutes and achieved what 3 days of conventional assaults had failed to accomplish. American casualties for the operation totaled 7 men wounded and none killed. German casualties included 38 killed, 47 wounded, and 155 captured, effectively eliminating their defensive capability and opening the way for continued Allied advance toward Germany. More significantly, the rapid collapse of what intelligence had considered an impregnable position prevented German reinforcements from establishing the defensive line they had intended to hold throughout the winter campaign. As Thomas McKenna walked through the captured German positions in the growing daylight, he found himself thinking not about military tactics or strategic implications, but about something much simpler and more personal. His father had been right about the importance of understanding what you were really trying to accomplish versus what people told you were trying to accomplish. The military had told him he was trying to overcome a strong enemy position through superior firepower and aggressive tactics. What he had really needed to accomplish was disrupting a complex system at its most vulnerable points, and that had required the skills of a carpenter rather than a soldier. The German defensive system had been strong, well-designed, and effectively implemented, but it had also been vulnerable to exactly the kind of analytical thinking and practical problem-solving that Thomas had learned during 15 years of construction work. The tools he had needed weren't specialized military equipment or advanced tactical knowledge, but rather careful observation, precise timing, and the confidence to apply civilian skills to military problems in ways that military doctrine would never anticipate. Within hours, word of the operation's success had reached regimental headquarters, then division, then Corps, generating the kind of attention that Thomas had never sought and didn't particularly want. Staff officers arrived to interview him about his methods, intelligence specialists wanted detailed explanations of his analytical techniques, and training specialists began discussing how his approach might be systematized and taught to other units facing similar challenges. But for Thomas McKenna, the real satisfaction came from something much more fundamental than military recognition or tactical innovation. He had identified a complex problem, developed a practical solution using the tools and knowledge available to him, and executed that solution with the kind of precision and craftsmanship that would have made his father proud. In the end, that was what mattered most, not the military commendations or strategic implications, but the simple knowledge that good work, properly executed, could make a difference when it was needed most. The immediate aftermath of the Grandmesnil operation transformed Thomas McKenna from an anonymous staff sergeant into one of the most sought-after soldiers in the European theater of operations, though he would spend the rest of his life insisting that he had simply applied common sense and practical skills to a problem that everyone else was approaching incorrectly. Within 24 hours of the German surrender, officers from 3 different divisions had requested his transfer to their units, military intelligence specialists had arrived to document his techniques for potential inclusion in field manuals, and war correspondents were competing for interviews with the Carpenter soldier, whose unconventional thinking had achieved what conventional tactics had failed to accomplish. Colonel Tucker personally presented Thomas with the Distinguished Service Cross in a ceremony held among the ruins of Grandmesnil, with most of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment in attendance. The citation read, in part, Staff.